and thank you for joining us in our remote format that we've been using the last couple of semesters here. And just to make a few announcements of other things that are coming up, we do have, in addition to MAPS, MJC also hosts a science colloquium on Wednesday afternoons, and we have one coming up this Wednesday on science, policy, innovation, and action. So the science colloquium talks are every other Wednesday this semester, and this Wednesday is one of them. And then also, we have 2 more MAPs coming up after tonight. We have one a month from now, Friday, March 19th, called The Legacy of the Carnivorous Period by Ed Clifton. And then coming up in April, on April 16th, we have a talk on the Mars rovers. So if you've been hearing news yesterday about the Mars landing, we have a talk from someone who was involved in helping with the cameras on the rovers. Roger Weens is going to be our speaker on Friday, April 16th. So for tonight's format, we have a speaker that is going to give us a talk. I'll have him introduced in just a moment. And then at the very end, we're going to ask questions. So if you have any questions that come up during the talk, then feel free to put them into the chat. We're going to be monitoring those and keeping track of those questions and writing down as many as we can so that we can ask at the end. So feel free to put some questions in the chat during the talk. That's one of the advantages of having joining us live on YouTube, is being able to ask questions. However, we will have this recorded and posted on YouTube. So if you know someone who had to miss tonight's talk, then it still will be available for them. All right, so to introduce our speaker, I wanted to get another one of our MAPS committee members, Mike Kennedy, to be able to introduce our speaker for you.
All right, thank you, Linda. It's my pleasure to introduce Justin Fisch. I learned about Justin in a strange way, actually. My wife, Cindy Davis, met him 2 years ago on an expedition in Antarctica. I didn't go on it because I get seasick easy. So anyway, Justin was there. He was, and it still is, an expedition guide with Quark at the time. Little background on Justin is always good for people to see how people got to where they are. Justin holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Sustainability Studies from the University of Florida and a law degree from McGill University in Canada. He's worked a lot in forestry research and geographic education for most of his career. And he's an environmental attorney and also a lecturer and guide with Quark Expedition. So he does both things well. And he's also been an Arctic Youth Ambassador with Canada Parks. Now, Justin hails from Nova Scotia, Canada, and he's got 3 passports. That's kind of fun, I'm sure, being able to shuffle those things. And he is a global citizen, basically, and he absorbs language like a sponge, I think. He speaks native English and French, and he has a professional proficiency in Spanish and Portuguese, and I understand a little bit of Chinese as well, of Mandarin. Anyway, he's a lawyer by trade and an outdoor guide by passion. So he's got those 2 things there. And he's led, for example, backpacking expeditions through the southwestern United States. He's canoed with groups down Florida's magical rivers. He takes clients up Nicaragua's volcanoes, and he interprets for people Bolivia's Andean culture. So he seems to be all over the map. And he has a passion for environmental protection and protected area systems, and that led him to work in his specialty of environmental law and policy, which is what he does out of San Francisco. And he also served previously with the Government of Canada as Parks Canada National Youth Ambassador for the 2015 and 16. And in this role, he found some new ways to help Canada's youth understand their natural history and cultural history, while helped engage and motivate a whole new generation of environmental stewards, which is part of his goal, I'm sure. So he has a passion for both Antarctic and Arctic travel and discovery. So that helps him keep a network of many involved youth and adults to further environmental education. He also formally taught environmental law at University of Ottawa. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Justin.
Thanks, Michael. It's far too kind. I really appreciate all of the kind words and the kind comments. I'm Justin Fisch, and I'm here to present tonight to the Modesto Area Partners in Science. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Like Michael said, I have a passion for environmental education and polar education, and I'm really excited to share what I've learned in my short years as a polar guide. Michael did out me, however. I'm not a scientist. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Geography and Sustainability Studies and in political science as well, and practice as a lawyer. So lots of intersects with science, but I am not a scientist. So I'll look forward to exploring this topic of Antarctica, the treaty, and the environmental protocol with you tonight, with the knowledge that many of you might have questions that'll challenge me at the end, which I certainly invite you to pose in the chat. The title of my talk tonight is "A Land Dedicated to Science, the Antarctic Treaty and its Environmental Protocol." And you might be guessing by the first slide, by the map of Antarctica, all the flags, what's he gonna go into? What's Antarctica about? What's this treaty? Why are we talking about environment? Why are we talking about science? All I know about Antarctica is it's 98% covered by ice. Well, we could start with speaking about penguins. Penguins are a big part of what people recognize about Antarctica. And we'll talk about penguins a little bit. We can talk about glaciers and the ice sheets, penguins and glaciers on the ice sheets. We could also speak about whales and the orca that inhabit the Antarctic. Could also speak about seals. All of these things will be coming up. Some human experience in Antarctica as well. So what do we know about Antarctica? Antarctica is 10% of the world's landmass, 98% covered by ice, no native human population, and was only discovered in 1820, a short 201 years ago, barely over 200 years ago. So to whom does it belong? All we know about land on this planet is as soon as you find land, you stake your claim and put a flag up and it belongs to somebody all of a sudden. Well, that's a much more complicated question in Antarctica. In fact, Antarctica belongs to no one and everyone in a lot of ways. This here is a map of historic territorial claims in Antarctica. There are currently 7 claimant countries in Antarctica: Chile, Argentina, the United Kingdom, Norway, Australia, France, and New Zealand. You'll notice that these claims to territory, this idea that certain territory belongs to a certain country, are not clear-cut. There's some overlap there. There's some overlap specifically in the area of Chile, Argentina, and the United Kingdom, where claims are not, clear-cut, and that exists throughout the world, right? There's boundary disputes, there's wars over land, but what's interesting in Antarctica is this still remains not clear-cut. This remains a non-open issue, and this is something we're going to explore in tonight's talk. You'll also notice that a significant part of the continent is unclaimed, Queen Maud Land, and that's the largest piece of unclaimed land on Earth. So we'll also get into that. Here's another way to visualize it. These are the various segments of Antarctica that are claimed, unclaimed. As compared to the previous slide, you can see that though we're talking here about a continent, right? Antarctica being that 7th continent, 10% of our world's landmass. You can see that all of these claims are not equal, right? You can see if I go back to the Australian side, that Australian claim on the east side of the map here, far greater than the land, for instance, that New Zealand claims, which, to be honest, is very little land at all, right? Mostly a sea, the Ross Sea, and an ice shelf, a permanent ice shelf that covers it. So what gets these countries to claim parts of land that's 98% ice covered, sometimes miles and miles deep, that they can't even access the soil in certain aspects. Well, we're going to go along a little historical journey to think about that. So historical claims to Antarctica date basically from the turn of the 20th century. The first claim was made by the United Kingdom in the interest of whaling. Whaling and sealing at the turn of the 20th century were huge industries. As you may know, electrification at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century was finally bringing online power and light to many people throughout the world. But nonetheless, there remained a demand for many, many years and for oil coming from whales, oil coming from blubber, and oil coming from seals, meat coming from seals. And those were bountiful in the Southern Ocean surrounding Antarctica. Again, the Southern Ocean had been fished and whaled for centuries prior to the discovery of the actual continent of Antarctica in 1820. But upon discovering the continent, one may know that humans inhabit generally land and not water. So countries, in order to protect their claims to hunting grounds, whaling grounds, sealing grounds, started staking claims around the Antarctic. The first to do so was the United Kingdom in 1908. The second, New Zealand, at the very urgent behest of the United Kingdom. Third being France, not long behind. Norway had long been and remains a large whaling presence in the world, staked different claims in 1929 and 1939. Australia shortly thereafter, again, another UK presence, really, kind of a dependency of the United Kingdom still at that point. And then you have two South American countries. These other countries, you're talking about European states, you're talking about New Zealand and Australia, which are predominantly European populations, immigrated populations. And then you have Chile and Argentina in 1940, 1942, right in the heat of the Second World War, taking advantage of diversions, essentially, where people weren't paying attention to Antarctica, and they staked claims. So here you see a little closer, I kind of point your attention to the bottom of the screen, where quite a few of these claims, you can see kind of the timeline of when the certain countries claim those areas and the unclaimed land as well. Much of this has been published recently, and plenty of different maps discuss these various claims. Though the ones we've seen on the map here are not the only claims to Antarctica. There have been historical claims by a number of different countries. Spain has made a claim, Japan's made a claim. Nazi Germany actually had a large kind of presence in Antarctica for 6 years, which we'll discuss. There are a lot of other countries that don't claim land on the territory presently, but have very strong arguments and political positions that would perhaps make them claimants in the future. The United States, Russia, Brazil, Uruguay, and Peru. So we're getting away from whaling here, right? You're seeing these dates, you're seeing 1908, and then you're seeing some of these final claims by the 40s, 42. And you wonder, what does this all have to do with science, right? What does this have to do with the environment? Why am I here at a maps presentation talking about this? I didn't come here for a history lesson. Well, bear with me. Well, we're going to get to the science. Here, I just wanted to present you a few very cool historical photos. We have a couple of the Norwegians. Norwegian claims in 29 and 39. Many of these claims were staked through expeditions, so polar expeditions. And this was the Norwegia expedition in 1929, silk flag provided by the government. 1938-39, as the Nazi Germany was kind of becoming a power in the world, dispatched planes to the Antarctic with the idea from ships that these planes would drop pins, darts with swastikas emblazoned in them, every 16 miles across 140 square miles of continent. 140,000 square miles of continent, and you drop a dart every 16 miles to stake your claim. This occurred at the beginning of the Second World War and throughout the early years. This land was called New Swabia. It overlapped with what is currently the Norwegian claim, as I showed you, and was a German claim for 6 years, but Germany in the surrender in Second World War lost this claim to Antarctica. So we're getting past the war here. We're getting into the Cold War. We're transitioning from a period of kind of global mayhem, global discord, global fighting to one of superpowers and really kind of showing one's strength. You also had at the end of the Second World War a very significant amount of generally young men and military resources that needed to be put to use. So one of the superpowers at the time, the United States, launches Operation High Jump. Here you see part of the fleet of 13 ships and 4,700 soldiers that go to Antarctica in 1946 to 47 to establish Little America 4. Little America 4 was a scientific expedition, but also a military base. And so you start seeing, aside from those 7 claimant countries, the kind of interest of the United States and later the interest of the Soviet Union in establishing territory in Antarctica. This 1940s cartoon kind of pokes fun at this idea that one would venture to the end of the world, to the poles, to this uninhabitable land where humans had never lived before. I mean, you think about all the places on the planet where humans have lived. The high Arctic had been inhabited by Inuit people for thousands of years. Humans had managed to survive there, yet humans had never made it to Antarctica. So what leads people to come this way? What leads people to try and divvy up this land in any way to claim it? Is it simply political ambition? Is it geopolitics? Is it a quest for resources? Is it science? Is it fishing? Plenty of those questions can be discussed. I think the main thing I want to kind of take away from this era, this early 20th century era of claiming Antarctica, of establishing sovereignty over the land, is that this was a contested landscape. This was a landscape that went through a First World War, a Second World War, the beginning of the Cold War, and basically became this continent that anybody who was anybody could grab. Anybody who had an interest could go down with their flag and stake it, as humans had done for hundreds of years before. So by 1955, this question becomes pretty serious, right? We're 10 years into the Cold War. We have this 10% of the world that doesn't belong to anybody. There's arguably resources down there. There's shelters, there's havens. There's even random stories about Hitler being sequestered down in Antarctica at the end of the Second World War, which is not true. So various claimant countries and various interested countries decide, let's go to the International Court of Justice, this newly created court by the United Nations following the end of World War II. And let's ask to adjudicate these boundaries. Well, Argentina and Chile, who rightfully thought the United Nations was controlled by European powers, which it had been established by European powers only 10 years previously, said, no thanks. We're not going to your court. We're not being decided. The future of our Antarctic land will not be decided by you. So where does this fit into law? I told you I was a lawyer. You probably don't want to hear much about law. Maybe we'll keep it short. But in the legal Latin, legal sphere, uti possidetis juris refers to the fact that there's no land without a sovereign. No land without a sovereign essentially means that any land can be claimed. Terra nullius. Terra nullius is basically a conquest era, so time of the Spanish conquistadors, English explorers, this concept essentially justifying their ability to claim and inhabit any land that was not already inhabited. Of course, that whole concept, the concept of terra nullius, completely ignored indigenous people at the time and completely ignored the folks who actually lived on that land. But that wasn't the case in Antarctica, right? We don't have a native population in Antarctica. So terra nullius actually, for the first time in human history, was a concept that could be explained and could be justified on the Antarctic continent. So countries want to take advantage of that, right? And terra communis, so this land of many people that could be claimed by a state. So where am I getting to with this? This idea that we have politics, we have power, we have war, we have potentially international law with the advent of the International Court of Justice. So countries big and small, right? We're talking from New Zealand, Norway size of country, all the way to Russia and the Soviet Union at the time, the United States. Countries can control territory. And it's the reason why we live in what is called the United States of America, and Mexicans what it's called the United States of Mexico. Folks live in Japan under a territory controlled by Japanese people. And the international law has evolved over the centuries, essentially, to recognize certain aspects of what is sovereignty. What is this idea that we live in a country, a nation? A few things are required. This idea of actual control. So there's a government that controls. It controls the people. It controls the landscape. It sets the laws. But not only does the government control, it must be recognized by other states. So this idea that we are in the United States, one could argue that government in the United States controls the United States, but also that the government of Canada recognizes the control of the United States over the United States. There have been a variety of different international law cases over the years that have kind of confirmed these concepts. So in a border dispute between Eritrea and Yemen, the International Court of Justice decides that an internal display of power and authority over a territory by the exercise of jurisdiction and state functions on a continuous and peaceful basis defines essentially the acquisition or attribution of territory to a country. In Clipperton Island, this is an island off the coast of Mexico that had been in dispute for decades between Mexico and France. The International Court of Justice says that the actual taking of possession is a necessary condition of occupation. A country must take steps to exercise exclusive authority over a territory. So when we think back to all these countries going to Antarctica, the United States setting up Little America 4, the Nazis dropping pins and darts all over the continent, these are attempts by these states to show an internal display of power, to show control, and to be recognized by the rest of the world. Well, the problem is in Antarctica, with a continent 98% covered by ice, miles thick, very difficult, if not impossible, to sustain human habitation without kind of inputs from the outside. These are really difficult to show. A country is not going to recognize that another country controls a territory when its occupation is only in the summers or only for select purposes. So the international community was finally coming around to this idea that maybe Antarctica is different. Maybe it shouldn't be what has always been in terms of how we run the world, if you will. So states decided to get into kind of a different discussion about Antarctica. Maybe instead of having sovereignty defined by somebody coming in and controlling or possessing the territory or being recognized by others, maybe we should define the borders of it by meridians. Maybe the eastward border of Brazil should be drawn down a line to the South Pole, and the westward border of Brazil should be drawn a line down to the South Pole, and that should be Brazil's territory. Maybe we should consider it an effective occupation, like we were speaking about previously. Maybe we should make this an international condominium, this idea that we all share this space. Maybe we should give Antarctica to one country and allow access for all others. This had been previously done. Spitsbergen, the Treaty of Spitsbergen in 1920, and the territory of Svalbard, which is today run by Norway for all intents and purposes, but allows any other country who's a signatory to that treaty to use resources on that land and to send citizens to work in Svalbard. That's this idea that you have a unilateral management, yet kind of joint occupation. There's also a couple other discussions, right? Do we want this to be a group of these 7 states, maybe 9 if we're thinking about the United States and Russia, governing 10% of the world? Or should it be maybe the United Nations that takes care of this? The United Nations, this newly created body from 10 years previous, could run this. Or our last option, we're in the middle of the Cold War. Why not go to mayhem? Fight it out. Well, things changed, 1957, 58. And this is when we get into the science talk. So the International Geophysical Year happens. We had previous polar years. The whole idea being that you perform all sorts of experiments at the same time. Countries participate to further science across the globe. Comparative data, as I'm sure many of you know, studying science is extremely important. Being able to control those variables, being able to control, the timely aspect of collecting data is kind of really interesting from a scientific perspective. So in 1957, 58, 18 months of science were organized with over 50 bases put into place and 12 countries participating. These countries being some of the claimant states, but also being others that participated. We have Belgium that jumped into the fray. We have Japan. We have South Africa that decided to participate in kind of doing science in Antarctica for the good of humankind. So out of this scientific cooperation, somehow, you think science is better than politics. Science is objective. Science kind of brings us together. Well, in the case of Antarctica, it did. 18 months of scientific cooperation bring the states in 1959, the very year thereafter, to sign the Antarctic Treaty. What does this do? This sets aside a continent previously claimed by 7 different countries as a scientific preserve with freedom of scientific investigation and banned military activity. Middle of the Cold War, a few years after Joseph Stalin's death, and we ban military activity across 10% of the landmass of the planet. This is huge, for anybody who lived during that time. It's the first arms control mechanism signed during the Cold War. It allows for states to conduct international inspections on each other's properties within Antarctica. And it's a very popular treaty. Over a quarter of the planet, quarter of the states in the globe have signed it, 54 member countries as of 2021, representing 80% of the global population. So what is this Antarctic Treaty? What is this contract that these states entered? Basically, it's this promise that Antarctica will never be put to military use. There will be freedom of scientific investigation. And moreover, not only freedom of scientific investigation, but free exchange of scientific data and plans. So if you make a discovery in Antarctica, you have to share it with the world. You develop a new antifreeze solvent because you figured out how to stop freezing at -60 in Antarctica. You share that with the world. So it's this knowledge for the human race, if you will. Territorial claims are put on hold. So those 7 claims I showed you previously, they're gone for all effective purposes for now. A nuclear-free zone. Now, 1957, we may not think about nukes and nuclear bombs that much these days, but if you think about 1957, any spare part of the planet where humans did not inhabit was essentially bombed for testing purposes in 1957. So the fact that this whole landmass would not be put to testing purposes is extremely important. It applies to the land. Stations, scientific stations established by certain countries are open to all others for inspection. National laws apply to the citizens of each country. So as you're visiting Antarctica, if I'm American, American laws apply to me. If he's Japanese, Japanese laws apply to him. If she's Chinese, Chinese laws apply to her. The treaty requires unanimous agreement for any modification, and treaty nations themselves ensure compliance with the treaty. The International Court of Justice is this arbiter of disputes. So this treaty is in the middle of the Cold War. I want to remind you what was happening in places where humans didn't inhabit, or frankly did inhabit. This is an atoll in the Pacific Ocean during the Cold War. Bombs away in so many different capacities. And so this scientific treaty, this idea that we come together and we preserve this landscape during this era, is extremely important. What does it do to these claims of sovereignty? Well, it puts them on hold. It basically says, we're not going to recognize any of these. Nothing you do on this continent, no actual control, no recognition by other states will be kind of enforced from a perspective of international law and recognized going forward. And no territorial claim while this treaty is in place can be enlarged. 54 member states, the latest being Slovenia in 2019. And these are the various parties acceding to the treaty. A wide number. So you have the 12 original signatories. You have consultative parties, which you call parties that actually participate in the science in Antarctica. And then you have acceding states. Acceding states are states that decide that they want to participate in Antarctica. They want to be part of the discussion, but they're mostly going to observe. They're not going to get a vote. They're not going to commit to going to Antarctica, inspecting, doing science, but they want to be part of the discussion. So what happens? What does this treaty do for all intents and purposes? Well, it establishes Antarctic law. This idea that countries get together every year in various places throughout the world and discuss how to manage this continent. So who discusses this? The 12 original signatories, and now currently 17 consultative states. So 29 different countries that are active in Antarctica have either permanent research bases or send ships down, send planes, send researchers to other bases, can, if they conduct substantial scientific activity through the establishment of a scientific station or the dispatch of a scientific expedition, they can participate in the making of Antarctic law. Well, what is the making of Antarctic law? You say, didn't we just decide Antarctic law in 1959? Didn't we just put forth this treaty and decide, okay, all sovereignty's gone, we're going to share this? Yeah, but there's a lot of other things to decide. You got to decide how to manage the flora, the fauna, the plants, the birds, the bees, if there were bees, there are no bees, the seals, marine living resources, the krill, mineral resources. What about mining? What about just generally protection of the environment, right? Science in itself, if you've ever been on a scientific expedition, can be deleterious to the environment. I mean, it can harm the environment in certain ways. So we have a wide variety of different agreements that have been decided by the states over the course of the last, as you can see, from essentially 1959 straight through to 2000, 1998 being the coming into force of the environmental protocol. And over these, if you will, 40 years, you have the establishment of this Antarctic law, this idea that you have the management of krill and maritime resources through CAMLAR, the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. You have these various pieces of Antarctic law working in conjunction with ocean law, which was coming around at the time, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. But then you get to the 80s, and we're understanding Antarctica a lot more, right? Science has been performed in Antarctica arguably since the late 19th century. Some of the earliest kind of hopes of establishing territory and recognition of other states were scientific stations. One of the first sails in Antarctica was the sail of a Scottish scientific station to Argentina. And over the course of those 80, 90, 100 years, you're discovering one thing about Antarctica: there's a lot of ice, but under that ice, there's a lot of rock. And in a lot of rock, you find a lot of iron ore. You find aluminum, you find coal, you find different rare earth metals that are really valuable. And so countries are starting to think, well, if we're spending all this money going to Antarctica, establishing our presence, establishing Antarctic law, we should be getting something out of this, right? We should be coming home with some metal, with some minerals. And so in 1988, the states signed the Convention on the Regulation of Antarctic Mineral Resource Activities. It's signed. States agree. However, you also have a massive campaign by Greenpeace and other organizations to push back on this. And the pressure was strongest in France and in Australia, who decided to back out of this convention. So you have this convention, mining companies are happy, states are going to get down there, and they're going to exploit minerals. And it very nearly happened. But only a few years later, you get to the environmental protocol. So the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea had been signed in 1982. And following those years, you had a variety of different agreements that had been entered regarding the law of the sea. As we had spoken about, kind of the law of Antarctica developed between the mid-50s and 1990 maybe, but the law of the sea had been very recent in the last 10 years. And in 1991, if you will, the law of the sea was done. And a lot of these treaty negotiators from each state are kind of interested in working in Antarctica. These states know each other. They've signed, they've agreed to measures for regulating the seas. And so then they decide to put their efforts into Antarctica. And they put together an environmental protocol, which basically gives the strength and the protection to the treaty that it never had. So the treaty was this great idea to protect Antarctica from military use, nuclear use, to establish it as a scientific preserve. But at the end of the day, it didn't require you to do anything to protect the environment. You could go to Antarctica, you could establish McMurdo Station, where the United States has its base and the biggest human population in Antarctica, and you could leave human waste there for decades, as some people actually on the committee here have experience with. But the environmental protocol changed that, and changed that in a very big way. Put together rules for maritime pollution, protecting fauna and flora, managing that waste that comes naturally from science experiments, establishes protected areas. So this idea that we have national parks and especially managed areas in other places in the world, we should put those in Antarctica. We should put marine reserves in Antarctica. And an evaluation of potential environmental damage. If many of you are science students at Modesto Junior College or interested in going into biology or chemistry, there's a good chance some of you will be involved in environmental impact assessments in the future. And that kind of concept was put in place in Antarctica. Let's evaluate what we're going to do before we do it in case it is deleterious to the environment. So the environmental protocol was signed for 50 years. The Antarctic Treaty itself is in perpetuity. So absent the falling apart of the treaty and states coming back on it, the environmental protocol actually has a 50-year timeline. So by the time the protocol is signed, you have a variety of different kind of international legal mechanisms to protect this territory. You have the treaty itself, you have the protocol itself, you have the Convention on Whaling. So this is the International Whaling Commission running it, kind of setting limits on the amount of whales that can be taken. And that's developing strongly through the 70s and 80s with kind of limits and putting in only scientific whaling. We have to remember that at the time the Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959, 38,000 whales were caught off the coast of Antarctica, 38,000. So whaling was still a massive industry at that time, and the Antarctic Treaty did nothing to stop it. As I said, it applies to land and not the sea. By the 90s, you also have the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, this idea that states can protect in any way they want the waters right off of their coasts. And you have CAMLR, which is a convention on the conservation of Antarctic marine living resources, protecting the krill being these tiny shrimp-like animals that are basically the lifeblood of the food web in Antarctica and feed all the whales and so many other species, is massively important. They're krill pills and krill oils and many different krill products are hugely in demand by humans nowadays. And so the idea that these convention would limit the catch is extremely important. So I told you that the Antarctic Treaty set Antarctica aside as a scientific preserve. What the protocol did is it sets Antarctica aside as a nature reserve, as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. And that's incredibly important because things will change in Antarctica. Things will always keep changing. But the one thing that will remain, and that has remained for the past 120 years, is that science is the primary activity in Antarctica. That doesn't stop countries, however. I'll go back to the sovereignty aspect and to the geopolitics for a little bit. Countries publish histories on their conquests of Antarctica and continue to. Countries emit stamps for all the various areas in Antarctica they've explored, the various individuals who have brought the country fame. And in no small way, this is kind of a show of sovereignty in itself. Countries, especially Argentina, have established post offices all over Antarctica. This one's on Heard Island. Countries have established place names. So on territories that are their own or around their scientific bases, they include in their national atlases the names of these places that they choose to name. Babies have been birthed in Antarctica. So this idea that you go down and you give birth and you start a community, an Argentine community in this case, as a way to show that the territory is yours. Families are sent to Antarctica to live for the summer. What a place to have summer camp. Send your kids to Antarctica. Well, if you're thinking, in the future, this is a way to claim sovereignty over this land, it's not a terrible idea. And religion is established in Antarctica. Russians build churches in Antarctica. And so despite kind of this focus, we moved from sovereignty to a treaty, to a focus on science, and then a protection of the environment. You still have this coming back, this idea of sovereignty being primordial. So this idea that countries will always want to claim land for themselves and themselves alone. But technically the treaty, if you remember correctly, says all these actions that you're taking post 1959 don't count for anything. You're not allowed to take steps to establish sovereignty in Antarctica after 1959. So what are countries legally allowed to do in Antarctica, either to establish sovereignty or to kind of participate in the governance of Antarctica? Well, again, we're going back to science. There are over 75 scientific bases in Antarctica, the latest being built by the Chinese. They're located all throughout the continent. In fact, countries sometimes very specifically build them in the territories that are the sovereign territories that they had claimed. The United States has a base at the South Pole, which, if you know anything about the South Pole and you remembered all the different maps I drew you of the claimant lands, every claimant land touches the South Pole, so the United States is in the middle of them. Russia, on the other hand, has a territory a scientific base in every single claimed territory. So geopolitical experiments as well. Some of these bases are whole cities. On the top right here, you see McMurdo Station, which is almost 5,000 people at peak summer population. You have various movable bases here on the bottom right, the Haley base, the British base. You have the South Pole base, the US base in the middle. And then you have various small bases. This base in the top left is a tiny Argentine base and then a Russian base in the bottom left. And what happens here? What happens at these bases? What are people doing? Well, people are there doing science. It's some of these are, like I said, are whole cities. And there are people living there, going to eat food in the cafeteria after their long day of work. There's archaeologists looking at life in Antarctica. Antarctica was not always covered by miles of ice. And so, digging down under that ice or digging through the rock and finding fossils and having paleontologists kind of study Antarctica is something that has taught us a lot about the history of the world and continental shift and plate tectonics and so many other aspects of life on Earth. We have biologists, both biologists working on land and ornithologists and marine biologists, experiments with penguins and whales and all the different species that inhabit Antarctica. We have botanists as well. Again, Antarctica was not always covered by ice. You have petrified wood throughout Antarctica, and folks go down there and kind of learn about the history of our planet. Antarctica is the only place where humans have never inhabited. So what a great laboratory to understand change, global change and climatic change on the planet than in Antarctica. You have astronomers. You have these extremely clear skies with very little light pollution, super high-end telescopes and temperatures that are hard to work in, but certainly reward you with great astronomy. And again, marine biologists who may work on ships, who may work throughout the world, kind of studying migratory whales, who can kind of track either these species, home ranges in Antarctica or recovery in Antarctica following the whaling years. That's one of the most interesting parts of research, at least for me, in Antarctica, is this idea that we would study a place that was so decimated, right? We were talking about whaling, 38,000 whales taken off the coast in 1959. And to see these populations come back and to have marine biologists track that. And again, share that data, right? Everything is shared. So if the Australians discover something on the east side of Antarctica, on the west side, where the Ukrainians are, they're going to share that data. You get a year or two to process your data or whatnot, or write your article, but you're always having to share that raw data, which is hugely important to science on the continent in some of these extremely hard to access places. And it's all governed by the Antarctic Treaty. It's all under this large auspice of this treaty that sets aside the world's largest scientific preserve. Research stations, 75, and the Chinese are extremely active in research in Antarctica. Some say to kind of poor ends. This idea of mineral exploitation will be reopened in 1948. So, a short 27 years from now, one could think that if environmental protection is not, of utmost importance for states and the planet, we could go to mining in Antarctica. And so that's something really interesting to think about as you're thinking about science, as you think about geology, as you're thinking about your future careers, this idea that we do science to understand what's in the earth, but then does it kind of lead to means that don't justify kind of the protection of the environment? So Antarctica is a land governed extremely uniquely. It's a unique land that has a unique arrangement for how to govern it. But that was only the start. That was only the 50s and the 60s. Today, Antarctica has served as a model for the world and is really a place to look for inspiration. And I would highly encourage you to come to the talk in a few months about the Mars rover, because Antarctica, in no small way, has led to that Mars rover being able to land on Mars just a few days ago. This is the various heads of state throughout the world. You see President Lyndon Johnson on the far right signing the Outer Space Treaty. This idea that we are going to protect outer space. We're not going to allow nuclear use in outer space. We're not going to allow military use in outer space. And no country can claim parts of outer space. Does that sound familiar? Does this idea of sending rovers all the way to Mars and sharing the data with the rest of the planet sound familiar? Well, it all comes from Antarctica, and it was incorporated into protecting outer space. 12 years later, the Moon Treaty, Agreement on Governing Activities on the States of the Moon and Other Celestial Bodies, 1979. So Antarctica is not unique in itself. It's not this only model on the planet. It served as a model actually for extraterrestrial activities in so many ways. But things are changing. And Antarctica, the protocol will be subject to revision in 2048. So will we keep protecting the environment there? I can't tell you. I can only guess. And this idea that the treaty is the best way to manage it, right? These 29 countries, there's over 200 countries on the planet. So this idea that 29 of them gets to decide what happens on 10% of the planet, oftentimes rich states, right? States that have the ability to send down these massive scientific expeditions and fund these tens of millions of dollar programs that it costs to run these scientific bases. These are the people who get a say in the governance of Antarctica. Is that equitable? It's a great question. I'd welcome questions on that. I'd warmly welcome anybody who attended this talk tonight to contact me. I'd love to talk more about this. I'd love to talk more about my career and the opportunities that I've been afforded as a guide in Antarctica. What I shared with you here tonight, I'm in no way an expert on. There are so many kind of wonderful colleagues that I work with who have taught me so much about this landscape, about the science that's performed on the landscape, about the different plants and animals on the landscape. And so I would highly encourage you to research further into Antarctica. And that's not the end. This is an ongoing conflict. This is a photo from actually the Arctic, from ongoing resource conflicts in the Arctic. But it's to reiterate a point that, as I hope you've learned in this presentation, Antarctica is a unique landscape that's come to a unique arrangement, but it always needs voices. It always needs discussion as to how it will be managed in the future. Because just because it's like this today in 2021 doesn't mean science will prevail tomorrow. And so I encourage all of you to get involved in the governance of Antarctica and Antarctic issues, and I welcome any questions you have. Thank you.
Hey, Justin and Susan, I've been collecting questions while you've been talking. There's a lot of different topics here, but they kind of fall into either law or environment science. The first off, we had Jeff who was asking actually a little bit more about the tourism. With tourism increasing over 10 times since 1992-93, what are the plans for controlling future growth of tourism populations?
Yeah, that is a great question, Jeff. Thanks so much. And I work in that industry, so call my response biased, if you will, and I would definitely appreciate you taking it with a grain of salt. So tourism, first of all, is managed by the treaty and by the consultative parties. So they set the baseline rules on tourism. So every year at the treaty consultative meetings, which are throughout the world and were held virtually last year, the states get together and they decide where scientifically protected areas are, where specially managed areas will be, where no-go zones will be. And that makes a huge difference in how the industry operates and how people get to Antarctica. Now, 98% of tourists will get to Antarctica by ship. And those being from generally South America, and 98% will visit only the Antarctic Peninsula. So only, if you look at the map, this kind of northwest portion, if you will, of Antarctica, that part of Antarctica is getting a tremendous amount of pressure and is managed both by the states, but also by the industry, right? This is an industry that has to protect itself because it's offering a wilderness experience, and this idea that people go not to see other people, but to experience the wilderness and the majesty of Antarctica as a landscape. So I think that I'm pretty positive about the future of tourism in Antarctica because I think that it'll be self-managed. The states have an interest in managing it. The industry itself has an interest in managing it. Nobody wants it to become kind of crazy. And also, all of the tourism, 98%, is focused on a very small geographic region of Antarctica. So if we want future tourism in other parts of the continent, there's plenty of room for growth there that is kind of well-managed growth into the future.
There are a couple of questions about the impact of life in Antarctica on the actual continent. So first we had, are the scientific stations taking steps to limit their environmental impact? A little bit more specifically, are they trying to be going green? What's the impact of those? And have there been, steps made to keep it clean?
That's a great question. Yes, I would say most definitely. I think it's difficult. It's certainly a very difficult question. You've probably seen actually a lot of news about that this week with the power outages in Texas, right? You're seeing a lot of these wind turbines freezing in Texas. And a lot of the kind of counter narrative has been that, turbines shouldn't freeze in Texas if properly designed. We have wind turbines in Antarctica, and that's true. At McMurdo Station, at the US base, that you have wind turbines that are operating in Antarctica. And so there are various ways, and countries have a very vested interest, Susan, in kind of greening their operations because diesel fuel is extremely expensive to bring down to Antarctica. And the idea that you're running all your operations off fossil fuel is unbelievably expensive. But the reality is our technology isn't quite there yet to run everything in a renewable and clean fashion. So that the bases are somewhat reliant on old technologies. And that's the cost of doing science in certain ways, right? It can be called ironic, if you will, but you go down there to study climate change and, you're flying down on, a fossil fuel powered plane and you're living at a base that's, powered by diesel. But to get to these places and to understand human impact on the planet, that's the cost of it. But we're really hopeful in the coming years. I think that things will change because they have a vested interest too. There's no reason you can't have bountiful solar power in Antarctica with sun 24 hours a day in the summer. So.
Yep, sounds good. Justin asks, does the Antarctic Treaty and territorial claims set a precedent for space exploration and planetary territories and land claims?
Yeah, Justin, it most definitely does. It sets I think, a positive precedent. I think that the biggest missing piece here, so I think I kind of ran over the Outer Space Treaty very quickly, but the Outer Space Treaty sets that framework, right? This idea that we're not going to use the outer space for military uses, and the advent of the US Space Force, if you will, in the last 2 or 3 years has kind of challenged that concept. But I think the Outer Space Treaty is kind of strong enough to withstand that. But in outer space, at least in my opinion, spatial waste is the biggest issue, right? Because we have kind of uncontrolled shooting up of satellites. Everything is digitally connected nowadays. And so what we need is this outer space version of the environmental protocol, right? We spoke about 1959, we have the treaty, and then it takes until 1998, so almost 40 years later, to have a protocol coming in place to actually protect the environment of the treaty kind of area. And I think we really need that in space because continued shooting up of satellites with no way to bring them down and keeping them in orbit will lead to collisions. And it's led to very significant collisions in the past. Luckily, these are usually microsatellites either hitting each other or hitting satellites out of commission, but it really has kind of dangerous applications in the future. So I think that especially the environmental protocol is a really good model for outer space.
All right, good. Cece asks, as future geography, she's one of our MJC geography professors, what type of jobs are available in environmental policies or sustainable policy?
Yeah, Cece, I as a former washed up geographer myself, no, I'd like to consider myself still somewhat of a geographer. I would say that geography is, a bountiful way to explore the planet. And if it's in sustainable policy or environmental policy, the US Antarctic program is a fantastic place to start looking, right? The National Science Foundation runs the US Antarctic program, and they have a variety of different grants for study. They have positions in which folks can work both in Antarctica, but in Antarctic policy. Obviously, the Department of State of any given country, whether most folks here are American and kind of would work for the US Department of State, runs these the negotiations from the US perspective as per for the Antarctic Treaty. So always need good people to be kind of consulting on policy change. And then outside of Antarctica itself, geography obviously is a fantastic background that I could speak, ages about in terms of how great a preparation it is for, kind of sustainable policy work in the future.
Okay, so switching gears to a little bit of the science, Bill asks or wonders if the countries are always playing fair with their science. Do they regularly share, or are there any intrigues behind the scene there?
Bill, that's a really great question. So NTI is like a cybersecurity organization. If you visit their website, they have a really good, and I'll drop it in actually the YouTube chat, but they have a really good background on what was discussed at every consultative meeting over the last 20 years or so. And you'll see that over the last 5 years in the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings, whether in Buenos Aires or in Tasmania, the issue of Chinese mining science, if you will, and geology has come under heavy, heavy scrutiny. China is obviously an emerging power in the world as a threat to many other states, but there is real questions about whether China's interest is in science or in mineral exploitation, or both. I mean, frankly, they can go hand in hand. What is kind of the saving grace there, Bill, is that these states are always allowed to inspect each other's stations. It's kind of hard to surprise somebody in Antarctica, if you will. You're coming up with a big ship or a big plane. And so, and taking a long time to get to these bases. But at the end of the day, you have this built-in treaty mechanism to be able to trust each other's science. Nonetheless, you'll see that at these discussions, I mean, there's heavy scrutiny on the Chinese side. So we'll see how that plays out in the coming years.
Okay. Bill actually asked another kind of quirky question here. He likes to, are there Antarctic police? What if somebody squats? You got a billionaire who comes in there and puts his own little resort there. What happens?
So that's a great question. So state to state, the police is the other states. So if you're not a treaty member, if you're a treaty member, the other states have a right to enforce the laws and this Antarctic law as toward kind of the other state. But if you're Bill and you're American and you want to go down to Antarctica and build yourself a summer house, well, you are subject to the laws of the United States of America. And under the laws of the United States of America, the Antarctic Treaty is put into law through the Antarctic Conservation Act, which basically says that you're not allowed to do that. You can't put your summer cottage in Antarctica. So it would be the U.S. National Science Foundation and the Antarctic Program who would be the police in your case if you're American, Bill.
So would just real quick, would there be like the U.S. military would come and kick me out? Who would do it?
Well, that's a great question. The military. So military. We did say, Bill, that military use in Antarctica is not technically allowed, right? But military support is permitted, so kind of on the gray lines. So let's say they come down there with one of their Hercules C-300. They've flown from, New Zealand. They might make a little detour to come get you, on one of their trips to resupply,
All right, so another sort of legal question, is permanent settlement the goal for countries to secure claims?
So it is the most important goal in terms of actual historical sovereignty in international law. So the kind of perennial case in this matter in international law is the case of Eastern Greenland. So those of you who may know Greenland know that it's now Danish. It has a certain amount of home rule, but it's Danish. But there used to be a question about whether Eastern Greenland was Norwegian or Danish, because the Norwegians did a lot of fishing off the coast and a lot of summer fishing huts and would, anchor their boats and this and that. So, but the Danish won the case because they lived there. I mean, they had possession and kind of permanent occupation, and permanent occupation is really the question in sovereignty. So currently that's frozen. Antarctica is a very unique place in which permanent occupation can't technically count towards sovereignty. But if the states back out of the treaty tomorrow, that idea of permanent occupation on the territory would go back to establishing these claims of sovereignty in the future.
Okay, so the anthropologist here wants to do a few humans questions. I'd love to know if anthropologists have gone down. It's been enough time that people have occupied the land that it could be historical archaeology at the very least. But there's also a question in the YouTube chat that's asking about just what it's like to work in a place that's so full of different cultures. Do they interact a lot? What's it like?
That's a great question. So I will tell you that I have not worked at a scientific base, though I have heard of some of these experiments. So Susan, I will drop actually some of them in the YouTube chat after the talk, because there is certainly some anthropological research that has happened, both in terms of the folks who've gone down on expedition or the folks who've lived in scientific bases. But I would say there is interaction between cultures in Antarctica. And especially in some of the locations along the Antarctic Peninsula where the bases are very close together. I mean, they're relying, like, for instance, the Brazilians have, the closest air access, right? Or the Chileans are the ones who are bringing people back and forth because they operate the airstrip, and the airstrip is right next to the Russian base. So there's all these collaborations. But some of the stations are extremely remote. And so you are at a US station at the South Pole. There's nobody for hundreds, if not thousands of miles. And so you're not interacting with anybody but Americans and maybe a few kind of guest scientists. But it really depends on where you are in Antarctica.
All right, great. So while we have been talking, Bill has been accumulating a few other questions that I may have missed. So I'm going to turn it over to him for a minute, and then I'll check and see if there's anything he missed.
Okay, so Susan and I are playing a little back and forth. All right. So there's a question. I'll ask a question by Shivnelli about global warming having an effect on Antarctica, and that's also related to a similar question: if the change is likely to occur via climate change, like if we don't reduce emissions quickly, will destabilize the treaty? And related to that, is what will Antarctica look like in 2150? Will global warming have an effect on the treaty and how people see it?
Yeah, certainly. That's a tough question. It certainly does. Climate change and global warming has a very, very real effect on Antarctica, and has opened up parts of the landscape and made access simpler. Antarctica in the dead of winter is nearly inaccessible and is basically inaccessible by ship, because it gets so cold that even the sea ice with salt in it will freeze. And so you can't get through, but with the strongest of icebreakers, and sometimes not even with the strongest of icebreakers. And so it's with global warming and with these temperatures rising, you won't have these ice sheets forming. You'll have glaciers melting. You'll have large tabular icebergs and kind of land-fast ice. So this ice that used to be permanent, if you will, permanently for thousands and thousands of years stuck to the coast of Antarctica, is now breaking free. And so all of a sudden, instead of kind of traversing, hundreds of miles across ice to just get to land, you can just get to land. And so that makes a huge difference. What I would point to you as an example there that's actually more kind of present, if you will, than even in Antarctica is in Greenland. The Greenlandic people have a really interesting decision to make in the coming 10, 20, 30 years, because the reality is, they're a country who has, subsided off fishing and various different industries for a long time, but their mineral resources are becoming far more accessible nowadays. And Greenland is the second largest ice field in the world, Antarctica being the first. And so that being kind of a place Greenland is not put aside as a huge scientific reserve. And so you're seeing the very real reality of like mineral exploitation and access to resources becoming simpler in Greenland. And there's no doubt that the pressure would be on Antarctica. Whether humans kind of decide to go that route or not, I can't guess, but the pressure will be there. And
related to that is Aaron's question about territorial claims coming mainly from wealthy colonial countries. Can you picture future scenarios in which third world countries get to have a larger stake in Antarctic politics, and that's related to the territorial claims, which I think goes back to the resources. There's another question about like what exactly are people wanting to find there? What's the hot things they're trying to find? So I think those two questions kind of connect a little bit.
Yeah, I glossed over this pretty quickly in the presentation, but this is where the debate comes in about what we should have done with Antarctica, right? This idea of it being managed maybe by one state for all the others in an international condominium, by a treaty, which it is currently, which is the choice. But you also have, and this is why it became such a huge debate, this Antarctic Treaty was signed 14 years after the creation of the United Nations, 15 maybe. But instead of utilizing this new international system that is the United Nations to govern, so all 200 get a say, you made this exclusive club of 12. That grew to 29 and now grows to 54, but really still 29 because the 54 they can watch. So actually the country who has been kicking up a stink about this is Malaysia. And of all fights for Malaysia to pick in the world, they picked the fight of let's fight the rich countries over them controlling Antarctica. This isn't fair. Let's bring it to the United Nations. We go to the United Nations anyway. We go to New York for our meetings in September anyway. Why don't we just go talk about Antarctica there instead of flying to Tasmania or flying to, Buenos Aires or whatever? That's a very real problem, right? If you're the country of the Comoros or if you're Madagascar, right, you're not going to go to an extra meeting every year just to talk about issues that may not or may not concern you every day. So This idea that wealthy states run it is a very real problem, and will in the future, if resources become available and if developing countries are interested in developing those resources, will become a huge bone of contention. What are they looking for there? It's mostly minerals. I mean, we're not talking forestry in Antarctica, but it's mostly minerals. But one of the big ones too is fresh water. I mean, we're talking about 70% of the fresh water on the planet, right? There have been systems evaluated to try and tow icebergs that come off of Antarctica to South Africa during periods of drought. Like, why not? Let's just anchor it off Cape Town and it'll, give fresh water to Cape Town for a year. So these are very real kind of possibilities in the future. And so water and minerals, and then the big one that's currently managed is fisheries, right? This idea that the states manage the fisheries around the Antarctic too is extremely important.
There are, and by the way, these are a lot of questions. Is everything going well for you?
Yeah.
Great. So we have some more couple new questions on your background, your multilingual background. This is by Justin and also Diana. They both asked these questions, and the question is: Are you multilingual because of the international nature of your work in Antarctica? And I know you're from Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
Canada, right?
Yeah.
But you've also lived in the United States, and so, okay. So are you multicultural because of that, multilingual because of that, and how often do you use those languages in your work? And related to that, Diana's question about you speak Portuguese. Did you learn that with the Brazilians in Antarctica, the Spanish, the Argentines, and the Chileans? So both want to know, I think, about your experience, your work in Antarctica. Is that what kind of made you multilingual?
I will say that I've only used Portuguese once in Antarctica, and it was in a place called King George Island. And I was actually just telling you this kind of story as the excerpt, is that the Chileans run the airstrip in King George Island, and they had offered in Santiago that actually the day before, I believe, an award to one of the most renowned Brazilian researchers in Antarctic research. And he had been flown down to Antarctica to kind of see the place, because he doesn't go down very much. And they flew him down as part of a resupply mission. And I got to speak to him in Portuguese. So that's the only time I've spoken Portuguese in Antarctica. No, but I would say to Diana, I'm just very lucky. I was my father's first language, French. And so I was able to learn that growing up, and picked up Spanish also by my father's doing, kind of putting me in Spanish classes very early on. And if you know, just the thing about Portuguese is it's just this kind of mix of French and Spanish, some Spanish vocabulary with French grammar. So we mix those two together. And, when I say I speak Chinese, that's a bit of a lie. I can say hi and bye. And I studied it for a little while, but I'm terrible. So, but no, I'm very lucky. And I do get to utilize those languages in Antarctica. So I think, Susan had a question earlier about the international nature of Antarctica. So the vast majority of tourists to Antarctica come from 4 countries, that being the United States, China, Germany, and Australia. And in kind of interacting with those folks, I do use a little bit of my Chinese. I do use a little bit of my French sometimes, but these are very international trips most of the time.
I have one more question, and then I'm going to toss it back to Susan to check in on any remaining questions. And I asked this early on in the chat, and maybe I missed it, but I don't understand why pre-1955, in the early 20th century, the 7 countries I think you mentioned, why were they making claims on areas far, far from the ocean, like inland in Antarctica? Like,
right.
What was it in for them? And I wasn't clear on why they did that, drop the flag and pretend to be, doing regular sovereignty work or something. Like, why did they do that?
And that's a great question. So the claims, all of the claims, so there's 7 claims around the continent. All of them reach the South Pole. They're kind of all triangular claims, except for the Norwegian claim. The Norwegian claim has no defined northern boundary, and no defined southern boundary. And the Chilean claim doesn't have a northern boundary, but that doesn't matter. Basically, what began developing in the 19th century is customary international law. So this idea that international law developed just because it happened. And it was codified, I'm going to jump all the way to the 1980s, where 1982, we decide on the law of the sea. And the law of the sea is now a statutory instrument that's agreed upon in the United Nations context. And it basically says that if you control coastline, you then control the land off of that coastline. And so this idea that a state would control coastline means that it could control the fisheries. So that's a first answer to the question, is that the first focus was always on the coastline so that you can control what is now the 200, if not 350 miles of coastline off of that coast, and depending on the geology under the seabed. Why they went to the interior was really to strengthen those claims a lot of times. And those voyages to the interior were few and far between, right? You have, Scott and Amundsen that are going between 1910 and 1912, and they're making the first trips to reach the South Pole. And then you have aviation come about in the 20s and 30s, and then you can go around and you can drop darts like the Nazis did. But otherwise, you had very few expeditions to the center. You're mostly on the coastlines because they didn't have the technology to get around to the interior of the continent, and occupation was frankly simpler on the coasts. Very difficult still, but simpler.
And the interior just strengthens their claims on the coast. It strengthens them. Okay.
Exactly.
And I think, okay, Susan, that was my question.
We had one last question from Mandeep, who asks, what other locations have you visited besides Antarctica?
Oh, that's a great question. So as part of this work, I'm very fortunate that I get to go to the Arctic as well. And maybe I'll give another talk on that in the future. But the Arctic is this wonderful ocean, ringed by 5 to 8 different countries, depending on how you count. And so I get up there often enough to kind of do trips similar to this in the Arctic environment. And I've just been very fortunate to kind of have studied. I studied in South America for a little bit, in Brazil, where I learned my Portuguese, and I studied in China a little bit as a part of law school. So no, I've been very, very fortunate to travel. That's something that I'm very passionate about.
Okay, great. Well, I think we've exhausted you enough and exhausted our questions. So
wait, there's one more question. If you
okay.
I just see species question. As the ice sheet melts, will that change the coastline claims as the pieces of property disappear?
That's a great question. So technically, no. Technically, the claims are over land, and you cannot claim an ice sheet. That said, the way ice sheets are in Antarctica now, this is a bit of an untested theory, right? Because at the end of the day, you can actually inhabit an ice sheet in Antarctica. You read Shackleton's voyages, that's what they did in a lot of ways. They inhabited these ice sheets. And there's an interesting parallel here actually to the Arctic that I just spoke about. So both Canada and Russia, with kind of the warming of the Arctic Ocean, are trying to protect their northern coastlines, right? There's a lot of arguments that actually going and shipping in the Arctic will get a lot simpler when ice melts. Well, Canada and Russia don't really want this, right? They don't really want these massive tankers, oil tankers, whatnot, going by their, sparsely populated Arctic shores. And so there's this very novel, actually, argument in international law that says, well, actually, Inuit people, native Inuit people who lived both in Russia and in Canada have historically inhabited the sea ice. They lived on the water for 8, 9, 10 months of the year sometimes. And so, but that is a claim that has just never been tested in international law. So the idea that one could claim ice as opposed to claiming land. So land gives rights to water. Ice doesn't technically give rights to anything because this is so unique. But I would love this argument to be made, if only for the theoretical kind of question of whether you could actually have a right to ice, because presently you really don't.
All right, so somebody sneaked in one teeny little question that's
Sure.
kind of brief.
Sure.
They're asking, are you going to be participating in revisions of the treaty in 2048? Do you have plans?
Oh my goodness, gee, it's setting out my career path for me, I guess. I don't know if I've thought that far ahead, to be honest. If I'm still around and kicking, then I will have an opinion, I'm sure, by that point. But I'm not sure I'll be at the table. I'd love to be.
All right. Well, thank you
Okay,
very much,
thanks.
Justin. It was such a great pleasure having you here at our MAPS talk, and definitely a lot of comments that people would love to have you back another time to hear about Arctic or other different experiences that you've had. And so I thank everyone else for joining and for all the great questions that they asked you tonight.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right. Well,